Thank you all so much for being here today. We're so excited to learn with you and with this great scholar and to partner today with Temple Emanuel in Denver, one of our great Denver partners in this program today, and to learn with Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, who is the director of Mosaica, the Religious Peace Initiative, which serves as a network of insider religious mediators, advancing both religious peace and mitigating crisis situations in Israel and the Middle East. Roth also works to connect religious leaders to the tens of community mediation and dialogue centers throughout Israel that Mosaica supports. In addition, Roth is a core faculty member at Bar-Ilan University's graduate program for conflict management, resolution, and negotiation, where he teaches graduate courses on religious peace building, as well as supervises graduate students. His book, Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, Text, Theory, and Practice, was published by Oxford University Press in spring 2021. Roth was the founder and director of the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution, the Mahloket Matters Projects, and the 9 Adar Jewish Week of Constructive Conflict, Dibur Hadash, Israeli Week of Mediation and Dialogue. Roth is a regular lecturer for MEJDI Tours, National Geographic, and was a senior research fellow at George Mason University's Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. Roth holds a Ph.D. from Bar-Ilan University's graduate program for conflict management, resolution, and negotiation, an M.A. in Talmud from Hebrew University, bachelor's in education in Jewish philosophy from Herzog Teachers College, and studied for 8 years in Yeshivat Har-Etzion, during which time he received Orthodox rabbinic ordination. Today's topic, very important, Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, Text, Theory, and Practice, based upon his new exciting book, which I hope you will pick up and which Alex will share a link to in the chat. And we appreciate all of you who are here with us in the Zoom and all of you who are listening by recording. And we, after the presentation, will have the opportunity to engage in questions and conversation. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Rosh Shmuley, for having me and having this opportunity to join in your amazing and expanding national, global Beit Midrash. It's very exciting. Thank you so much. So I would like to do, I'm going to do a shared screen, and I want to do a little bit of discussing about my book, and as it's called, Third-Party Peacemakers in Judaism, Text, Theory, and Practice, and talk about exactly that. I want to try to connect some of the different chapters in terms of the text and the practice, especially that I'm engaged in today in the conflicts going on in Israel and the Middle East, and then open it up for questions. So I want to start. So the way I divided up my talk is to take you through some of the different chapters, just to give you a little bit of like a taste from what did I try to do and why did I do it. I'll mention, Rosh Shmuley, this is not my book talk, but another publication that I wrote recently, which connects into my work today, called Insider Religious Mediators, Advancing Religious Peace in the Context of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, also came out and was also recently published. But I'll touch upon it a little bit. I'm going to talk specifically about the text, theory, and practice of Jewish mediation, Jewish peacemaking. And my book starts in the preface. I tell a little bit of the story of how I got to this. I start with the Hebrew Talmud department. Rosh Shmuley just read through some of my bio. But the truth is, the story for me gets started in the Beit Midrash, in the yeshiva of Yeshivat Har-Etzion, the yeshiva where I merited to study for many years in 1993, and I started my studies as an 18-year-old. Just around the time that the Oslo Accords were being signed. And the opportunity of having text in a Beit Midrash environment constantly be encouraging us as young 18-year-olds to understand how to argue different sides and to hold up opposing truth about very obscure ancient disagreements, and then having that exact same intellectual, spiritual, emotional strength to be able to apply that to the most difficult, contentious, religious, political conflicts taking place at that time was amazing. And to watch our rabbis stand up and disagree for and against, while all around the country, there were mass demonstrations of people not being able to listen, not being able to think, to understand the other side. All that brought me into a journey of wanting to connect over the years between my passion for Jewish text and my passion for the field of conflict resolution and peace building. But in a book, which was mostly, which was an academic publication, I started from from the year, I think it was 2002, 2003, where I was studying at the Hebrew Talmud department, which no one knew what that was until this movie came out called Footnote, that won many prizes about this very obscure little Talmud department that we deal with ancient text and ancient languages. And while I'm sitting there studying ancient Greek and manuscripts, things are literally blowing up around us in Jerusalem, in the country. And I began this journey of how can I connect in a very clear way between all these textual skills and between the life and the world that's going on around us. And I started looking for where can I do studies on Judaism and conflict resolution, religion and conflict. And I ended up finding my way into Bar-Ilan University, where I was promoted. I continued to serve there as a faculty member. That they were one of the first universities to explore what does religion have to say about conflict. And so many, or I'll say, what does religion have to say about conflict resolution? And this is going back 20 years ago, when it was the core assumption that religion only helps to sustain conflict and cannot serve as a possible bridge for conflict resolution and peace building. I became exposed to a very important book, who then subsequently became a friend and mentor, I believe, of myself and of Rav Shmuly's, Rabbi Dr. Mark Gopin, who wrote a very important book that I think impacted both of us in a lot of his work, called Eden to Armageddon, where he started a chapter about Jewish peacemaking and what does that look like. And he wrote within that chapter on Jewish peacemaking, he wrote just a couple of pages about Aaron, older brother of Moses, serving as a peacemaker, a little bit about Rabbi Meir, talking about him as a peacemaker. And I remember reading those 2 pages and be like, that's it? There's only those 2? There's nothing else that within our text teaches us about mediation, about third-party peacemaking? There must be more. And I went ahead and I wrote my Ph.D. about Aaron as a pursuer of peace, comparing it to other cultural models. I'll note that I began a journey of wanting to write a book about this. But then as I was finishing my PhD and starting to think about writing a book, I was doing one last search to make sure I knew everything there was in the field and I hadn't forgot anything. And then all of a sudden, this amazing book comes up of Fundamentals of Jewish Conflict Resolution. And I had almost a heart attack of saying, seriously, somebody else has just written about this? Like, there's got to be 2 Jews writing about Jewish conflict resolution. I got a conflict. And I thought this is going to be like huge, intractable, violent. Turns out, thank God, we were able to mediate it, because he wrote about all Jewish texts relating to interpersonal or intergroup conflict without a third-party mediator. He drew the line of his study. This is Rabbi Howard Kaminsky. Highly recommend this book. Anger management, how to have difficult conversations, how to engage in sacred disagreement, comparing the Jewish text to contemporary scholarship. But he did not discuss the role of the third party, of the mediator, when I want to bring 2 sides together. So thank God. But I didn't only engage in academic studies and in text study. I also had the opportunity for 20 years to teach at an amazing institution, the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, where I subsequently opened up a Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution that continues today to promote a program called Mahloket Matters, How to Disagree Constructively, of how text can impact the brain's ability of how we engage in difficult political, ideological disagreement within our synagogues, within our homes. And then a few years ago, another common friend of myself and Rav Shmuley, Rabbi Michael Malkior, one of the great religious peacemakers and social justice leaders of our time, told me to stop teaching about him and about religious peace academically and come join him. And that's when I became the director of Mosaica, the Religious Peace Initiative. So the book is literally about third-party peacemaking in text, very heavy on the text, constantly looking at what are the different theories that are going on here in terms of conflict studies, and what are the implications for practice, both from an education perspective in terms of programming that I ran for many years with schools and training rabbis and training lay leaders, but also in my own experience in the field of serving as a third-party peacemaker in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'll just, again, I'm going to give you like a little, like a little taste of each of the different chapters and some core take homes. If I have time, we'll do a little bit more of an in-depth, but we'll see. I want to leave some time for questions. So I start my chapter from Muhammad to Sulha. This is the most difficult chapter for Jews, easiest chapter for non-Jews. All my rabbi friends are like, couldn't get through that chapter, it was way too hard. And all the academics are like, that one's the one I understood. But it was important for me to frame, before we look at Jewish text, to create a conceptual framework that all the great religions, first and foremost, have their ideal peacemaker. Okay, there isn't a program on Christianity and peace building or mediation that won't start with talking about Jesus as a role model. I work a tremendous amount in the with Muslim partners in the Arab sector, with Palestinians, and every time there's any conversation about interpersonal mediation or intergroup mediation, they're always going to start with Muhammad as a mediator, that before he was a prophet, he was first and foremost a mediator. And that's what allowed him to gain the reputation that he had and the legitimacy within his community, that he was able to reconcile between warring groups and to serve as that type of role model. And it was actually reading some of that literature, in addition to Mark Gopen's book, people like Muhammad Abu Nimr, that was one of the first scholars to write about Islam and conflict resolution, that I was like, wait a minute, how come nobody's written anything about Jewish conflict resolution? Like, what about Jewish models? Like, there's got to be something about this. It can't just be about other religions. So in that chapter, I kind of look at what are those different models, how these different religions kind of portray their paradigmatic peacemaker. But I also was curious at looking at anthropological studies, because I was interested in not looking only at Jewish texts from an ideal perspective, but also from a practice, like what actually happened historically in Jewish communities in terms of mediators. We know about Aaron, but I want to know about what were different minhagim, what were different customs that were taking place within these communities. And to create a conceptual framework for comparison, I want to look at different cultural models, not religious models, different cultural models of mediation and peacemaking. The most famous of which is the Arab Soha model, not necessarily Islamic, because as I'll point out in my book, Jews did Soha. It was a cultural model where the mediator is very different than Western liberal, mediation. The mediator, the third party, is not a neutral professional outsider. It's a well-respected insider that's deeply connected to the different parties in conflict. that does shuttle diplomacy back and forth, meeting with each side, and then brings them to a reconciliation ceremony. Very different than liberal Western thinking, which is always bring people together and then have them talk directly. Try that in the Middle East, it won't work. So that also has implications, this chapter, for our work that we do in, as Rav Shmuel mentioned, we support through Mosaica 70 community mediation centers, which include 10 in the Arab sector. Now, when you want to create a community mediation center in the Arab sector, you have to make it totally culturally appropriate, because what's going to work in Tel Aviv is not going to work in the Bedouin city of Rahat. Even who the mediator is, how are they operating? So what happens when you train a bunch of sulchaim, men, sometimes also we have courses for women, sheikhot, sometimes they're together. It's fascinating how they can work out the seating. Sometimes the rabbis, I'll talk about that, they can't sit with the rabbaniot, but the sheikhs and the sheikhot, we found ways for them to sitting together. But how do you create that model? And this book has actually helped in the research in working with the Arab sector, with the municipalities, with others, to think about how do you build the right model to counter the very, very significant problem of violence in the Arab sector, of the Arab minority within Israel. How do you make that actually be able to prevent conflict? So that's our Sheikhs as Mediators programs. Chapter 2, I go into Aaron, okay, who, I think if you catch, any, somewhat knowledgeable, Jew who knows a little bit about rabbinic literature, they'll know Aaron, of course, the peacemaker, right? People who only know the Bible will be like, wait a minute, which chapter was that? Did I miss? Because I don't remember him really doing like a lot of peacemaking there. I remember him doing a little bit of like, I don't know, giving into golden calf stuff, but where was he? So it's a rabbinic concept, and I explain how that evolved and what were the rabbis trying to do in a way of recrafting the persona of Aaron from being a high priest to being, where only the children of a high priest can become a priest. I only can be a Kohen if my father was a Kohen. By the way, full disclosure, I am a Kohen. So that's why I'm sure I got involved in this work in the first place. But when they say be a student of Aaron, it's reshaping him as his midot, his attributes that can be learned and lived by anyone. So I was interested in looking at all of the different, not just the texts that are from the Tannaitic time period, but I was also interested in looking at 1500 years of commentary, because when I'm thinking about towards practice, if I can find really important commentary and wisdom, Jewish wisdom about peacemaking, very often it's going to be in the commentaries on how Aaron was acting. What does it mean that there's no one more humble and lowly of spirit than a peacemaker? Well, that implies that peacemaking can really be egotistical. So you better try to check your ego and role model humility as you engage different parties. But also this has inspired a lot of the work that I do today, and I share a little bit, in the work of mediating between religious Zionist rabbis and Islamic movement sheikhs or sheikhot, and just the way you see how Aaron met with each side separately, built tremendous trust, brings them together, brings about reconciliation. There's more that I can say about that, but I'll hold off. And we also, over the years at Pardes, we turn these into middle school, high school curriculum. Like, how do you teach this in schools? And we're doing that more and more in Israel as well. Like, how do you have this become core culture, that when you're studying rabbinic texts, that you also learn skills of mediation? When you're studying skills of mediation, you learn that it's also Jewishly inspired. Chapter 3, this is where I try to say, okay, let's go beyond Aaron. we know that Aaron was a peacemaker. Maybe we didn't know everything about, oh, I forgot to mention one really cool tidbit. See the guy on the bottom there of the screen? He's a saint from the Atlas Mountains. What was interesting to me was that the Aaron model of a single spiritual leader who's in charge of making peace between humanity and God, and then therefore also being charged with making peace between different people, is very, very similar to the anthropological studies that have been written about the saints of the Atlas Mountains, which are Sufi, that they are like a tribe that live alongside the Berbers, but every time they're in charge of like their spiritual kind of, work, and it's hereditary, meaning it's passed on from generation to generation. And every time there's a conflict, an individual saint will go and get involved, and they're known to be people that they themselves are not engaged in conflict. So there's something about the Aaron model as a like, if you think about the Israelites as like kind of basically a Bedouin people with this priestly class that kind of lives alongside in the camp of the other tribes. And Aaron as a peacemaker is supposed to be, again, making peace between humanity and God with sacrifices that we know well from the Bible, but the rabbis are kind of filling in the blanks. It was almost obvious to them. Not that they knew about the Atlas Mountains, but this is the way it worked, is that you would have these, and what's interesting is that the tension within the Muslim world that happened between, who's a spiritual leader of a saintly class, where it's passed on from generation to generation in your blood, to being, one that you can, as people became more urbanized and less Bedouin, people became scholars, and it had to do with your merits and how much knowledge you had in Islamic law, that you became part of the ulama. So the transition of the Aaron model of leadership, priestly model of leadership, but also peacemaker, being turned into basically a rabbinic figure, be the student of Aaron, and not be the son of Aaron, right, is something that I think connects into what we know from other anthropological historical transitions. Chapter 3, I wanted to continue looking at classic rabbinic literature, meaning we're talking about the early rabbinic literature, Midrash and Talmud, up to 5th century. Again, I'm also looking at the commentary on that literature, but the key sources that I'm looking for of where are their models, where are their stories of third-party peacemakers. I was looking in rabbinic texts. So I started off talking about Rabbi Meir that I mentioned that Mark Gopin noted, but I found another story of him. But there are not only like these, well-respected, high, rabbis, but there is also a wonderful story that I love. It's known to be one of the favorite stories of the Baal Shem Tov, of the two jesters, the two badchanim, that used their humor and humility as very, very simple people to go and make peace between people. Very different than like the most respected person in the whole Israelite camp of Aaron. Like, really only he can do this? And that text is saying, no, actually anyone can do it. Use your personal wisdom, and it's a beautiful story contrasted with a rabbi who's not so much a peacemaker. I looked really hard for years. I said I've been teaching at Pardes. I had taught at Pardes. I no longer teach at Pardes, but I taught at Pardes, and I taught grad students. And I remember the day when some of my female grad students at Bar-Ilan said, where are the women? Which is always the question, where are the women? And it's a question, in my work today in mediating in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where are the women? How much are they involved? And we involve them. Happy to talk about that if we have time for questions. But I was interested in from a textual perspective. But again, Talmud is very much written by men for men. But it's not only that, it's also that when you look at ancient models of peacemaking and mediation, as opposed to contemporary models, it was always the men who is the well-respected insider. But what's important to understand is that women played an incredibly important role in these very traditional patriarchal societies in peacemaking, but it was much, much more behind the scenes. They're not the ones leading the public ceremony in the square, bringing the sides together to a public reconciliation process. But the whispering and the behind the scenes, so many stories are of women doing that. So with knowing that that theoretical studies and anthropological studies about how women have played a very important role in traditional society peacemaking, it was able to help me actually identify two rabbinic stories of how women played that role, and to say that's actually third-party peacemaking that women played in very, very hierarchical, patriarchal, pre-modern society. So I wrote about a Roman noblewoman who played a very important role in helping avoid a violent war between the Jews and the Romans, and doing exactly the way the literature says women can serve as mediators, that she was an insider connected to both sides, and she was able to give advice in order to prevent another bloody Maccabees versus Greek type of war in a very nonviolent way. And it's actually that story that becomes the very first example of nonviolence within Judaism. And actually, what does it mean to go out and demonstrate in a persuasive, or what they call a conversive way, that you can convert the other side's opinion. So it's a great story. Every time we're doing nonviolent demonstrations and advocating, we use that story. But a lot of those stories in those first couple of chapters, I think people know. I think people know more of those stories because it's people are more aware of Talmud and Midrash in general. But I wanted to try to push it and look also in early, in medieval and early modern rabbinic literature, because I'm looking for both paradigmatic but also historical models, like what actually happened, what precedents of Jewish peacemaking existed out there. So I start my chapter 4, with one of the heroes of my book called Rabbi Yosef Siracusti. When I'm originally, as a child, I grew up in a small little town called Syracuse, New York. And I'm like, seriously, there's a rabbi named Rabbi Siracusti, and he was a peacemaker. Like, he is very much going to feature in my book. So who is Rabbi Yosef Siracusti? He was the first rabbi after the expulsion of the Jews from Sicily, which happened at the same time as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. He was the first rabbi that ends up in Sfat, in Safed. And there were only just Sufi Muslims there at the time. Like, afterwards, like another, 500 rabbis are going to come from Spain and create like one of the most important rabbinic centers, of that time period, as many of you know. But he was the first rabbi to get there. And he becomes very well known in that world. He leaves almost nothing. One letter that he left. But what's interesting is that I found in through scholarship, not me, but I found in a book about letters from the Cairo Geniza, a eulogy about him, how he served as a peacemaker, also amongst the poor. But another rabbi, a mystic, 2 generations later, is saying, like, one of the great peacemakers of the Jewish people ever lived here, and his name was Rabbi Yosef Siracusti, and he knew how to make peace even amongst the non-Jews. And that's so incredibly important, meaning that the Muslims would ask him to be their mediator. And that plays a really important role, because our own is really very intra-Jewish. And when I'm looking for texts that push the needle just a little bit to say, like, can this be also a more inclusive conversation? Where are there texts that say I have an obligation to be making peace, not only within my own community, but in the broader community? Like, imagine if every 5th grader in this country grew up knowing that text as well as they know about our own loved peace and pursue peace. I think that plays a very important role. And there are later halachic authorities that actually refer to that example as that there's a commandment to pursue peace. I go into Hasidic masters and how they pursued peace. Spoiler, sometimes they would be praying together. And then how Misnagdim made peace. Spoiler, they would be learning together. Okay, it's like everyone with their, what brings you together? But a great story of Volozhin. Who are the mediators? How do they mediate? And their contract, their actual compromise, their actual mediation agreement and what did that work, and how did they do both mediation and, but the absolute all-time hero of the book, which is, it was when I first started writing about him, is when I knew I had enough material to write the book, is the Chida. The Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Alevi Azulai, who I think he's in the top 100 all-time rabbis, like all-time rabbis. I want to push him up to like the top 10. Like that was kind of my, like, I want to get him into like, at least the polls of the top 25. He very, very well known, wrote over 130 books. He grew up, we're talking 18th century Jerusalem. So he's like a Palestinian Jew, culturally, roots in Morocco, but also Ashkenaz. There's so much I can say about him, and I could give just a whole course on him. But what I love about him in the story, I wrote just 8 of the stories were about him, because he left his personal diary, which all of a sudden like allows you to hear in first person one of the greatest gdolim of all times, like how they're just seeing the world and what's going on. And he traveled on behalf of the small Jewish community in Hebron to go raise money throughout Europe. And he goes from city to city, but he doesn't, for him, raising money was a mitzvah. He wasn't just a schnorr. It was like rock stars showing up at your town, like the Chidas coming to town, and like everyone's running to go greet him, and just his relationship with his wife, and then passed away, and like just how he's like dealing with his depression, like. But then he's like, every time he went there, he felt so strongly that we're in darkness and we are in exile, like spiritual exile, because there's so much hatred in the world. And like he would go to a community, and he had such a reputation that here's a well-respected insider outsider coming in. Everyone started bringing their problems. And he would talk about like how he would go ahead and do these reconciliation processes, and try to resolve the conflict. I have a really long, if we have time, maybe I'll touch upon my favorite story. I brought it in the slides, but if you're ever travel through Europe, I really recommend taking the Chida with you. It drives my family a little bit nuts, because when we're sitting in Venice, like I have the kids be like, now, I want you to find every single place that the Chida visited. When you go to like Paris, and he talks about what was it like meeting the king. He was doing a lot of interface stuff also. He's just a rock star. Or like in Amsterdam, like every Jewish community that the Chida visited, it's the pride of their community, because it was like the Rambam showing up. But as he grew in his ability to be a peacemaker, basically doing the Jewish Soha, okay, his people would keep on asking him to do more and more work. The story that I want to talk about, if we have time, I don't know if we're gonna have time, is how he spent 8 months just working out a major conflict that the Pope himself had tried resolving and failed. And the Chida used certain wisdom of how to do that. And I use that model today of how to train rabbis and educators, and also evident inspiration to not give up in our work in the most difficult conflicts here. So it's also, this chapter is really important to me because we engage rabbis as mediators. And when I'm talking about rabbis, I'm talking about like primarily the more right-wing religious Zionist rabbis, the rabbis that are not necessarily connected to the Valley Beit Midrash, if as Rav Shmuley might know, people that would most likely all disagree with everything Rav Shmuley has to say. Those are the ones that I'm interested in engaging. And engaging them to first and foremost just see themselves as mediators in their communities, peacemakers, and then slowly connect them to the sheikhs. Okay, it's being recorded, so I'll be careful. The 5th chapter, I wanted to look at lay leaders, not religious leaders, but like talk to me about minhagim, customs, like how do Jewish communities function? And to me, this is also really important and impacts the work that we're doing today, which is that throughout Sephardi communities, Ashkenazi communities, you can find just traces of how there were people that were known in their community as Rodfei Shalom, Mitavchei Shalom, Pashranim, and Nichbadim, meaning there actually were quasi roles of people that were known as the community peacemakers. The same way today you have Solchaim, you have the Soha leaders, but they were called Rodfei Shalom, meaning the concept of a Rodef Shalom, a pursuer of peace, was not just a midrash of our own, but it actually was a living tradition within Jewish communities. And just to give you, and this a lot of it I find in rabbinic responsa literature, where it's a great resource for finding out what did Jews like to fight about, because they would have all their fights in community and then write to the rabbi of like, help, we don't know what to do. So in the question, which is an amazing window into what's going on in community life, they would talk about how these pursuers of peace then entered in and tried to help. Now, of course, if they're talking to the greatest rabbi of the generation, it's generally because they didn't succeed. But there's really interesting characteristics, which is, if you look, the earliest example I find is Spain, 12th century, in the Rimigash. But it says, and pursuers of peace entered in between them. Prague, and people of truth, pursuers of peace, entered themselves in between you. Italy, and the distinguished ones pursued peace and truth, worked. Morocco, it's the most developed, and pursuers of peace, we even have the names of some of them, entered in between. There's a few characteristics that you find in, whether it be in Sephardi or Ashkenazi communities. One, I never found a pursuer of peace, always pursuers of peace, as opposed to the Aaron model, where he was like the saint, that he worked on his own. These were well-connected insiders, that it's my connections, it's your connections. Let's create like kind of this delegation of mediators, that everybody uses their web, their networks of connection. And so it's always in the plural. They are very proactive, like Aaron, that they didn't wait to be invited in. It's not like somebody came knocking on their door and be like, hey, we got a family dispute or a community dispute. But if there was a conflict, they got involved. They were involved in both compromise agreements, like what were called psharot, that are contracts, non-coercive. Sometimes they would even have the local Beit Din, religious court, sign on it, which is what's done today in mediation, that you'll bring it to the court and we'll give it kind of like a stamp. And they would also do reconciliation processes. So you have this basically concept of community mediation that within each of these communities, and I'll talk about this at the end, the same way you have like, what is a healthy community? Well, you have people that are involved in education. You have people that are involved in raising tzedakah. You have people that are involved in helping escort the burying of the dead and visiting the sick. And well, you also had people that were the volunteer mediators. And that tradition has been lost really since the unfolding or the the collapse or the moving of all these different ancient communities, for various reasons. Many of them in the 50s, 40s, 50s, when they picked up and moved to Israel, these ancient communities of Morocco and customs were kind of lost. By the way, the same thing with Ethiopian Jews. The Shmagla model is very, very interesting and has been researched about their model of mediation within the Jewish communities of the Ethiopian community, which is actually still continuing to exist in Israel today. And they actually are recognized by the Israeli authorities. And it's a whole other conversation. So when I think about my work today in the world of community mediation, okay, so as I mentioned, we one of our programs, we operate a government tender for 15 years, where we support the 50 community mediation centers and 20 initiatives, including in the Arab sector, including in what are called the Jewish Arab mixed cities, where I do a tremendous amount of work, where you have, basically Palestinian citizens of Israel living alongside often, religious Zionists people all in the same building, and being able to mediate between all of them and between connecting rabbis and sheikhs to not just, we don't do dialogue groups, no dialogue groups. They're working in the field, solving problems, building trust, and we have a few thousand volunteer mediators. And I think Israel is actually quite unique in the way we've created a system of community mediation. America has community mediation. It's not as developed, in my opinion. Anyone, you're welcome to disagree with me. It's not as developed as a national network, even on a state network. In certain places, in Maryland, it's more developed. in Los Angeles it's developed, but it's not as developed as it is in Israel, where you have these 70 centers, each one very culturally appropriate to their community. But we'll have like an annual conference where about 600 volunteer community mediators will show up, which include, Arabs, ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionist people from settlements to secular people from Tel Aviv, and they're all talking about like how are they doing this in their school, how are they building disputes, the same type of disputes that these ancient pursuers of peace were doing, they're doing today. And I just find it very important to kind of connect that point. So my final chapter, I talk about the text, theory, practice, and scope of third-party peacemaking, where I end with a text that actually already made it into the Valley Beit Midrash talk once. Rav Shmuel, if you're listening, I listened to your interview with Rabbi Malkior, and he used the end of my book where it talks about in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, where he says that somebody who's pursuing peace does it between individuals, between a husband and wife, between and then he goes on between city and city, between nation and nation, and between government and government. And we're talking first century, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, time of the destruction of the first temple. And then I note that when Rashi, the great medieval commentary, quotes that midrash, he takes out the end of it. He says a pursuer of peace is between individuals and between husband and wife and family, but he takes out the whole government, nation. And it was mentioned by one of the great commentaries on Rashi, Rav Chaim Hershenson, who was himself an important pursuer of peace and justice, where he said that, because in Rashi's time period, there was no point in a Jew thinking that they could one day be a mediator between governments, between states, between people. They were focused very, very much on their Jewish community, with inside their, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he's dealing with wars, he's dealing with armies, he's dealing with the Romans, he's dealing with and so I wanted to kind of bring it to that point at the end of my book of like so many of these examples that I looked at were very, very interpersonal, family, because that's where Jewish text was at, that's where Jewish peoplehood was at. But today, now, where Jews do have access, and there is a state of Israel where they're involved in a few intergroup conflicts, just a few. And I'm, where is the responsibility of people to get involved in bringing back that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? That's what I mean by scope, that it's not just the interpersonal, but it's also on the interreligious component. And, most of my work is very much behind the scenes, and this is being recorded, so I won't talk about it too much. But our work, as I said, both in the our work of the Religious Peace Initiative was founded by Rabbi Michal Malkior, who, as I mentioned, has already been featured in the Valley Beit Midrash, with his late partner Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish, who's the man on the right hand side of the screen. Sheikh Abdullah, for those of you who don't know, I would like to say, I'm assuming people have never heard of him. If you have, you can write in the chat that you've heard of him. But I want to have a major Hollywood feature film about him, that the same way every person knows around the world who Martin Luther King was and who Gandhi was, every single kid needs to grow up knowing who Sheikh Abdullah was. He is the founder of the Islamic movement, founder of the first Islamist jihad movement. And then he went through a transition when he was in jail, how he restudied Islamic texts, and then came out to be the strongest advocate for nonviolence and for religious peace, and mediated between Hamas and between Fatah and between Israel. And all of that work that he did is an incredible story. He left many students who continue his work that we work with. One of them is a man that I hope you all know who he is. And if you don't, I highly recommend you Google him immediately, Dr. Mansour Abbas, who is the head of the Islamic party that makes up the Israeli government, who works day and night in the world of religious peace. So our work in cross-border work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict throughout the Middle East and in the mixed cities is part of that. idea of taking these Jewish sources and making them come alive as models. So I'm going to pause here. I'll do a closing text, but I want to leave some time for some questions now.
Okay, should I go first? That was the second hand raised. Okay. Thomas, do you
I'm
want
going to go for it.
Okay. All right. This might sound kind of weird to ask this question, but I was wondering about the relationship between mediators and teshuvah, and could this actually be used on a macro scale, basically? I mean, if that sounds like a weird question, you just say.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Okay.
Between what? Between mediators and?
Teshuvah and mediators, and could this be applied to a macro scale, like, you know, eventually big conflicts and stuff like that? You know, repentance, stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Were you saying Tisha B'Av? Like, as in?
I must have said it wrong. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I just tried to understand. So meaning like Tisha B'Av as in like a day of where we remember like internal hatred and things?
Okay. Basically what I was thinking in terms of is like making up for it. Like you remember all of that stuff inside of you, that your own part of it, and mediators and stuff.
I think she's saying teshuvah.
Oh, okay. About repentance, you meaning? Like about making amends with other people?
Yes. Okay, that's what I meant. Sorry. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure I understand your question. That's okay. That's fine. Well, I would say that the tshuva process is one that's more interpersonal, meaning it's how I ask forgiveness from you or how you forgive me. That is my colleague and friend Howard Kaminsky's book. He's got a whole chapter about 100 pages of his book is all about how do you ask forgiveness, how do you forgive, and comparing the laws of tshuva, of repentance, with contemporary restorative justice and all that type of work. My book connects into that in the space of how do I, as a third party, facilitate a tshuva process of how somebody can kind of do that. So that does connect. But I also heard a second part of your question, I think, which is like, how can this become, I think you were saying kind of practical on a larger scale. What do you mean by that? What do you have in mind?
Just thinking in terms of acknowledgement of, you know, like one country has done something wrong and the other one's done something wrong, and can we actually get this settled? Acknowledgement, in other words, a collective acknowledgement of wrongdoing on both sides, if that makes sense.
Well, you know, again, I'll connect the two parts of your. My focus was much more on the identity and the methods and the values of the person trying to facilitate that process. And I think, and part of the argument that I make in the book and I make in the work that I do today is that, you know, especially in my work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not lacking in what the solutions are. What we're lacking in is who the right mediators are. And any Secretary of State or President or UN or quartet, while they play an important role, they have no ability to engage the most influential Islamic leaders in the world or the most influential rabbis in the world that are playing a role in this intergroup conflict being stuck. But if you can get influential rabbis and sheikhs, Islamic leaders, working together to mediate between the most influential, then you could bring about a healthy reconciliation process. So my argument is it's not the message as much as the messenger and how the message is being portrayed and being framed. So if you have an international court saying, go ahead and do a restorative justice process, a truth and reconciliation, it will be strongly rejected. But if you have religious spiritual leaders that have the significant trust serving as insider mediators that are part of their community, but yet mediating, then you can have a game-changing moment. But again, that's sort of on the border between this book and the other book that I just wrote that I mentioned.
Okay, great. That's what I was looking for. And I'm sorry you had to listen to my horrible.
No. I apologize that I misunderstood. You were great. Thank you. There was another question.
Yeah, I've got a quick two questions. So the first, and I think actually Jonathan provided in the chat, that the name of the person you mentioned was that Sheikh Abdallah. That's the name of the person.
Sheikh Abdallah Nimr Darwish.
Okay, that's can you write that in the chat? Well, I'll look it up. But it piqued my interest in finding out who that person was, and to do a little more research on that. But the other thought I had, I'm actually in Berlin, Germany right now, and I was walking around the city today, and on the external of a building, there was the word peace mentioned in many different languages, all throughout the world. And one of the thoughts that came to my mind was, is there a common definition of what peace is? And you talked a lot about trying to arrive at peace. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure you're operating to some degree from a definition of peace that you want to arrive at. And I'm just wondering if if there's a good definition, and if that's agreed upon. And it's not necessarily, I think I would imagine that a word used in a specific language has that same connotation, but I'm just wondering, are there different understandings of peace out there in the world?
Great questions. So first, I just shared in a link the website that explains about how religious peace works in the Middle East. In the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a page about Sheikh Abdallah and some of the work, and you can see his videos. It's part of the S. Daniel Abraham Center's Center for Middle East Peace in their website called Progress is Possible. So you can check that out and learn more about Sheikh Abdallah and about his followers, etc. Most conflicts in the world are over the definition of peace. I mean, peace is on my terms, right? Peace is what I want. But in the book, I relate to it, especially in chapter 1, where the commentaries get into the different definitions of shalom. When they say Aaron was a pursuer of peace, well, what does peace mean? And I'll say there's primarily two definitions of peace. Peace can mean, actually, there's two definitions. I'll say it like this. There's a distinction between the word peace and shalom. That peace comes from the word praxis, which is, all about coming to an agreement and ending a conflict of a disagreement. And that can be associated with more of a cold peace. The Bar-Ilan, who is one of the authors that I write about, 15th century, talks about that people think that peace only comes in the absence of conflict. But he said, but the name of God is shalom. The name of Allah is salam. And shalom comes from the word shalem, shlemut, wholeness, completeness, healthiness. When you say in Hebrew, how are you? You say, ma shlomcha, how is your peace? So shlemut, wholeness, completeness, is much more literally holistic and more of a positive, warmer peace than just a peace agreement. And there's all sorts of interesting implications, because then who is a pursuer of peace? Is it only a professional mediator, or is it anyone that can help bring about, healthy relationships within a community? It also, what's interesting, I mentioned the Chida. When he uses the word shalom, he's referring to basically that warmer peace or reconciliation. Like when he talks about these two parties in the community that hadn't spoken with each other for 12 years, and he's like, I was able to bring them together and there was shalom. They haven't resolved the structural parts of the conflict yet. That took him another 8 months. They don't have the compromise agreement, which is peace in the agreement context, right? A mediation agreement, but they have shalom, meaning they're whole again. They're able to say Shabbat Shalom to each other. They're able to share each other meals. There has started a reconciliation process of healing. So those are the two. And what's interesting is that split that the commentaries make is a split that people have said linguistically and culturally between different cultures around the world, Eastern concepts of peace versus Western concepts of peace, and has a lot of implications. So that's chapter 2. Maybe one more quick question before we wrap up.
I think there was just a quick question in the chat. Jonathan said, wasn't the Sheikh Abdallah the son of the or a Hamas leader?
That is incorrect. I apologize. Sheikh Abdallah Nimr Darwish was predated Hamas, meaning when he started the when he started Usrat al-Jihad, it was in the 70s. So yes, he sat in jail with Hamas leaders, and the leaders of Hamas eulogized him together with rabbis and all around different people, and they said, the same way you were the first one to think of holy war, you predated us by 20 years. No one thought of it. You were the one who 20 years before your time thought about holy peace and religious peace. They said, we don't agree with you. We're not where you're at now, but we respect you. But he himself was certainly not a student of Hamas, a son of Hamas. He actually grew up a communist, like many Israeli Arabs. And then he became religious later in life after 1967.
One more question here.
Can you give us an example of the methodology of peacemaking and an example of it? To tell us how does one proceed, and then in real life, can you give us an example?
In 30 seconds. It goes back to one of the themes that you find throughout the book, which, you're looking at historical models, you're looking at midrashic models, you're looking at, all these are, but what's very clear is the distinction between what I use in my work today of insider mediation versus professional outside mediation. When two people have a dispute in liberal urban contexts, they want to go to somebody who doesn't know either of them, who has a professional and a degree and is really, really going to help solve it. They'll pay them money and they'll bring them through a very professional process, and then they'll come up with an agreement and have resolved the conflict. And then they won't have that mediator being involved anymore. In this context, what you're going to have is an insider who's deeply connected to the grandparents, the grandchildren, the families, all the different sides, and they stay in the community. They're part of that community. You see that with Aaron, how he's very much connected to the different parties that he's reconciling, and he goes and meets with both of them separately, which is also very typical of non-Western approaches of peacemaking, where he just sits with them, listens to their pain, and then brings about their reconciliation. And the same thing with the Chidah, the story that that I didn't have a chance to share, but I think it's the most clear beginning to end example of exactly how Jewish peacemaking works, where he notices already from the very beginning that it's more than the money that they're fighting over. There's a deep hatred between them. And if we're going to deal with that, only talking about the money and the land, we're never going to be able to get anywhere, because we have to try to figure out a way to tap into how to transform that hatred into love. And his dual track peacemaking methodology, as I was kind of alluding to beforehand, how he's getting them first into a shared sacred space, and then he's got them walking together on Shabbat. He's holding their hands, so no one's going to say no to him. They all want to be close to him. And then how he escorts them into this party, that a niece comes from Pizarro, and they're like, oh, we all want to be together, toasting each other, and he's sitting in the room and he's so awkward. He's like, oh, it's so, I'm like, I can't, I'm just like this nerdy rabbi, I want to just talk Torah. And they're all getting drunk, but he's like, but the peace is increasing, meaning they're liking each other again. They're remembering that they're family, that they're community, that they're reconciling. And then just all of his work of, at the same time, doing that peacemaking, that reconciliation, that healing of relationship work, he's also doing all that deep work of how we actually going to have a non-coercive agreed upon non-coercive agreement that both sides are going to sign on that will actually resolve the scarcity issues, like the tangible parts of the conflict. So each one I'm looking at the identity, the methods, and then what are the implications for how we're doing peacemaking today? That liberal peacemaking, Western peacemaking has so much to learn from ancient wisdom. And especially when we're dealing with illiberal, deeply conservative type of ethno-national religious conflicts, we certainly need to tap into that type of wisdom if we want to be able to engage some of the most difficult conflicts that are so entrenched. So, as I said, lots of examples. Do I have a minute? Oh no, I'm out of time. I want to just share one last. Alex, can I have 1 minute left?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I'm charging into the 1.5-minute video that you did in the beginning. I just wanted it to end. Wait, you can't see those. I just wanted to end quickly with my book cover and text. Just give me 1 second. So my looking for a book cover that kind of captures all these ideas, which was not easy. And I'll just share with you very, very briefly that one of the texts that I love that became the cover of my book is this text by Rav Chaim Falaji, 18th century Izmir, where he said, "May God in his mercy give me the strength to make a special charity fund committee that should comprise special individuals who will serve as Rodfei Shalom, as is the case for other holy committees like Chevra Kadishas, in order that as soon as they hear of a conflict between two individuals or within the community, they should be able to dedicate all of their efforts and make peace between them. Their membership in this committee is conditional on their taking a formal, strict oath that they will not become angry at all, even if people curse them and hit them, and they should be careful not to speak harshly and to be patient. And there is no doubt that if they do this, they bring redemption closer. And it goes without saying that they themselves should not be engaged in conflicts at all and should be forgiving. And a great gift comes out of such a gathering for the sake of heaven. And there is no need to spend money at all on this, except for a community official who will be responsible for gathering the Rodfei Shalom together." So that text, which is basically the vision that every Jewish community, every community needs to have their volunteer peacemakers, their mediators, every family needs their mediators, every community, every country that get involved. So I had that text written up on a parchment, on a cloth, by a friend of mine who's in high tech, but also writes Sifrei Torah, like the way the ancient, what's it called? Hippocratic oath doctors, like, the way you have the to have that be like the Rodfei Shalom oath, and then we give that out to rabbis and rabbaniot and other leaders as they finish a course, that they should hang it on their wall and remember that that's a Jewish charge to be a peacemaker. And that's the cover of my book, is that text, which kind of sums up the text, the theory, and the practice of inspiring us and hopefully, teaching us a little bit of why and how we can all be peacemakers within our own context. So with that, I want to wish you all a Chag Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Roth, for joining us today. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, Temple Emanuel. Next week, our next program is going to be on Wednesday, June 8th. We hope you can join us for Prose Bowl, Innovative Halachic Change or Gaming the System with Rabbi Tzvi Hirschfield at 10 a.m. Pacific. And thank you all so much for joining us today.
You're awesome. All right. Take care.